Hi, Vickie. Good afternoon.
Hello, Stefano.
Thank you very much for accepting my invitation to talk about war, actually, war as reset. You are a priest in the Church of England. You're based in Milan. And what I really like is that being an Italian, usually for us priests are male, but you're a female priest. So your voice is going to be very, very interesting for us. I started these web series 2 months ago, 7 weeks ago, when the war started, especially because I felt there was something wrong, not only in war, but in media, something that I call media voyeurism or media bulimia, where we move from COVID to war overnight. And of course, many wish the pandemic was nothing more than a bad dream, a nightmare. The truth is that the pandemic is still very much a problem, a reality for the world population as we speak, and many wish the Russo-Ukrainian war is nothing more than a bad dream, a nightmare. But according to psychoanalysis, nightmares can only disappear when their meaning is represented. And this is what I'm trying to do with this series, go a little bit in depth, beyond media voyeurism, media bulimia. Because it seems very much that war is attracting us. We are so interested about war. One could also say that war is in our nature, and war is the opposite than the Vanity Fair. Actually, war for me is the atrocity fair. Vickie, what is war?
It's interesting that you mentioned that some people claim that war is in our nature, and it brought to mind for me a line which is in the Old Testament, which is in the Book of Kings, and I can't cite the exact verse, but it said something like, in the spring of the year, when kings go out to war. And it just took for granted that war was part of human existence and that it was almost part of the routine of life that kings would need to go out to war for whatever reason. War is a product of incapacity to negotiate the needs and the conflicting needs at times of various peoples. It's the product of also the capacity to go to war. So if you're able to exercise power and think you can take what you want by force, then you'll do so. It's also, I think, the product of insecurity and fear of not having enough or not being able to meet the needs of the people that you're responsible for. War tends to break out, I think, I'm no expert, but if it's just a fight with your neighbor, then that's not a war. A war actually is something a bit more large scale and a bit more official than that. So it does tend to break out between leadership groups, which then bring their people into the conflict in some way.
Is war masculine? And what is the masculine and feminine element in wars?
That's a very psychoanalytic question. I think a lot of women, just in casual conversation, we like to say, well, if we were running the world, we wouldn't have all these wars. So there may be intuitively within us this sense that war has an inherently masculine kind of power demonstrating function in some way. And it's interesting to speculate, if women were running the world, would there be fewer wars? But I think, as a woman speaking, it would be really kind of displacing the problem of anger and violence onto men, simply to say, oh, well, if women were running the world, there would be no war. What looks to be the case, the feminine aspect of war in some cases, seems to be also about how the vulnerable are affected by war. the feminine aspect can be mothers trying to protect their children. It can be mothers fleeing to safety. It can be mothers whose sons are sent off to be fighters. It can be women who, in some cases in a more traditional society, lose the breadwinner in their family. That's looking at it from a kind of traditional point of view. I know that now many women are also part of the armed forces of countries. But my intuition and my feeling is that it's still kind of a masculine pastime. Pastime is the wrong word, but that there's a very strong masculine element to warfare.
You know, I noticed these in the past 2 months when I started this web series. I asked as many women as many men if they wanted to talk to me. And men would say yes. And women would say, let me think about it. So there is also perhaps a self-reflective attitude that perhaps is what brought these women you were talking to. If we were running the world, there would be no wars. So perhaps there is an action by men, immediate, almost uncontrollable, while women have a capacity to self-reflect without the impulse to step into action. As you said, men's pastime. Who knows? Why war turns normal people into beasts? I was reading on the newspaper a couple of weeks ago about this soldier, very young soldier, under 25, who asked his wife, they were Russian, emigrated to Crimea. He is, or was, a soldier on the front line, and he asked his wife permission to rape Ukrainian woman. She said, do it, but on them. This is obviously the continuation of the question, is war male? So it seems, no, it's not only male, but it's really also the proof that war transforms people into beasts.
The thing that you've just recounted really provokes in me a kind of visceral response. It's a sickening story. It's sickening on every level, and it's kind of hard to react to what you've just told me in a kind of rational and reflective way. I'm really almost left without words. One could almost imagine, without justifying, that in the heat of a moment in which men were in battle and then everyone, was sort of, attacking people and women got in the way, and then a kind of gang rape where people think afterwards, oh, I lost my mind, what have I done? With a sense of remorse. To have asked your wife permission to do it and to decide you're going to be beastly in a rational and predetermined and premeditated way is so appalling. I'm really at a loss to explain it. I almost say, you're the psychoanalyst, you say something about it. I find that just
your emotion is very important, your emotion you're feeling right now, and I am sorry I caused it. But I think it's somehow a collective emotion. It's really unbearable. When I read this news, I felt, come on, this cannot be. Is this another fake news? And I double checked, because it was a very newspaper that was quoting a very important anti-Russian radio in Ukraine. So it seems the sources are true. Of course, it's not only the Russian. The Russian are famous for these also during the Second World War. History books talk about it, but it's not only about the Russian. And really, my conversation are not to demonize the Russian, but really to try to understand why we take out the worst. And maybe you, as a religious person, as a priest, this can be reflected also. And it's a question, is this reflected in the Bible, in the Gospels? Is it reflected in the literature, that when man is at loss, becomes a beast?
I was thinking about that when you were asking the question before. Do we get pushed as a human being to a point, you know, maybe in the fight and flight kind of reaction where we do choose to push back and to fight back in ways that then become beastly? And that's why I mentioned the thing about the premeditated aspect of deciding to be beastly, which was so shocking to me. But we've seen really in our own lifetimes, the war in Bosnia and the Balkans, we saw the beastliness of that, of neighbor turning against neighbor. We saw it in Rwanda with this incredible explosion of violence. We see, if, you know, I've not been there personally, but if the media reports are true, we see potentially systematic rape also in China. With the Uyghur people in an attempt to kind of force a kind of integration. It's, you know, scripture does not teach us that war is the answer. Certainly the teachings of Jesus do not tell us that's what we're supposed to be doing. It doesn't say to fight back. It doesn't say to rise up against the oppressor. And so there may be something more innate in our human nature, which is an aspect of our failings as human beings to be, you know, the full human beings in its fullest sense.
Could it be that war is about compensation? World War II has been proved was compensation of the defeat of the Germans and the Austrians, World War I, maybe even the end of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the values related to it. The more I talk to people, the more I think about it, I think this war is really very much a continuation of not World War I and World War II, but actually and the confrontation between the Austrian and the Russian before World War I, when really there were two worlds, one against the other. One could say it is a compensation of the fall of the Soviet Union. Putin said it many times. The worst day in his life was the day that the Soviet Union collapsed. Or could it be that this war, or any war, is a kind of reset? And so a reset of what? Because one could also say that the crucifixion of Christ was that. Going backward was such a beastly or brutal event to go forward, salvation for everyone.
I was thinking of some of the issues around honor and shame and this desire to defend honor, and the way in which, in many respects, the crucifixion of Christ tried to undo that set of values in which I need to defend my honor, which is part of perhaps the compensation aspect of, you know, I can't bear that my homeland looks humiliated, or it looks smaller, or it looks less grand than I had put my hope in. In theory, Christ's refusal to play the game of the political authorities and his willingness to go to a completely shameful death undoes some aspects of this need to defend honor. And yet, as human beings, we find that very difficult to avoid doing. In terms of a reset, it's a pretty political concept in a sense. There may be elements of it. It may be something really more for political scientists to evaluate. I could imagine countries that go to war wanting a reset. You know, if there is that sense of you know, I don't have my rightful place in the world or the rightful respect and power that I should have. I will demonstrate my power and I will reset the table to a new reset, in a sense. But it's a failure to use the means of dialogue, negotiation, respect for peoples, because one could argue that there was a kind of reset when the Soviet Union split up. Agreements were reached, borders were set, people signed up for a reset, and for people then to say, oh, but I'm just not going to accept that, so I'm going to go and just sort it out myself. I suppose that happens often in the world, but I don't think that we can use that to justify by any means that way of going about business, really.
Yeah. Well, my idea of the reset is more about on the Ukrainian side. They have tried to say that they want to go west, but not because of McDonald's, Hollywood, or BMWs or our lifestyle, but because they want to be able to live in a country where institution will not collapse when authoritarian leaders or nation will attack them. One example is the US, you know, with the attack at the Capitol on 6th of January 2020. Although an healthy democracy, the United States could go on. What the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England, other religion could help with, because the reaction of the West and the NATO is let's support unilaterally and one-sidedly Ukraine with everything possible. You know? Then, especially when I look at the Italian scenario, the pacifist says, no, you have to negotiate. And of course, I would also agree, let's sit down and negotiate. They tried, although in a very shy way. But it seems there is someone who's not interested in negotiation, is interested in annihilation. So Putin, until he reaches his objective, which it seems the first objective was to take the full nation and now to take certain areas, he will not stop. So how is it possible to negotiate with someone that doesn't want to negotiate? From your point of view, from the church point of view, what would be the suggestion or the path? Because I find it's very difficult. Those that want to send a lot of tools to Ukraine, and those that would like peace talks, but the reality is really different. It seems that both sides are not really looking at the reality, that there is an aggressor, somebody who has been invaded, and we cannot go in depth to really try to understand what could be done before this spreads. I'm reading a new Stefan Zweig these days. He's saying, why did we go to war? War and Second World War, it's a tragedy. The end is not reset. How could we prevent it? How can we stop before it gets bigger and bigger?
Good question. You know, and if the Pope, who is a great man, a man of tireless energy, if he's struggling to find a way forward, you know, it's not as if a little person like me or any other person professing a religion will suddenly come with the breakthrough, because you ask this key question: how can you begin to sit down and talk, call it negotiate, with a person who doesn't want to? And I guess I would also say, when the perception is that the vision of the world and the vision of right and wrong and process is so vastly different that we actually don't seem to have common ground in our vision, that makes it immensely difficult. It makes it immensely difficult. And I think one of the things that has depressed me in these months, looking at things and seeing the media as well, on the one hand, is an excessive desire to just find, you know, the white cowboy hats and the black cowboy hats. So let's divide it into good and bad, because we like things to be clean and neat.
Yeah.
That doesn't take us very far. And the other thing that I found disturbing is what I kind of would call a kind of armchair diplomacy, which, in the comfort of my Western democracy and my freedom of speech and freedom of expression, I decide for the Ukrainian people that they shouldn't fight for the borders of their country and their freedom, because it doesn't suit me, because my cost of living will go up. It offends my sense of values as someone who doesn't like war and violence. And I found that also distasteful, that other powers would presume to decide for the people of Ukraine whether they should want a kind of freedom that they desire or not. And so I'm not answering your question in a sense, because I don't have an answer, but I do find it immensely difficult. So in a sense, the role that the church can play is perhaps the role that Pope Francis is trying to play, which is simply a continual invitation to those with power to talk, to begin to speak, to begin to negotiate. And I don't know if he will make any headway with that. But I think it's also important to stay in touch with the people of Ukraine in as much as it's possible, so that they don't become the person in the middle that other people are deciding for, either deciding, no, you need to fight this to the death, and, you know, to the total defeat of Russia, or no, you need to give up now, set it down, give away part of your territory, and accept, you know, what Russia has decided for you. I think we need to be careful that we're not trying to decide for them. But that's as far as I think I can pontificate on this question, really.
This what you just said, our wish to stop the war so that we can go on enjoying our life, remind me of what Yarina Grusha Passamay said, an Ukrainian woman. And she said, when I hear about the Western wanting us to dialogue, or wants Ukraine and Russia to start talking, especially Italian and German's media, I think, or an image comes to my mind, is that of the woman that is pulled on the stage, is on the stage because someone pulls her hair, and there she meets the man that raped her the day before. And from the audience, people start to shout, kiss, 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 as if the woman has to make peace with this man. But actually, her wounds are still bleeding. Her hands are shaking. Her lips are also bruised. So this person is inviting psychologists to go on TV and talk what is really about trauma. That is our incapacity to digest, incapacity to go through consciously about something that is happening, that is too big, and this goes into the unconscious. And then this woman says, the audience wants them to kiss so that we then can keep on watching the show without being disturbed. You know, somebody said, I want Netflix, I don't want the Donbass. So give me Netflix, give me entertainment. So this writer said, a dialogue is not possible right now. I don't say this is not possible in the future, but it's not possible until the wounds will become cured. I interviewed Ukrainian colleagues, somebody who is also at war, a woman that just fled, and they were part of the same psychoanalytical society with Russians. And they told me 2 months ago, killing was illegal. Now is a must. Really shocking this back in Europe. Of course, we see Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan. It's so far away. And now we are into this manic reaction to war. As you rightly say, also wanting war to stop so that we maybe can go on with our life. And I would like now to share a mea culpa, because when the COVID started, I started a series called Lockdown Therapy, where we were all home, we couldn't go out. There was a lot of uncertainty, and I hoped that COVID could help us to decelerate, to be an opportunity to decelerate, to work out a new inner-outer balance, an opportunity for regain a sense of interiority, spirituality, creativity of the soul. But understand I was naive. That was my wish, you know. And I realized that what Michel Houellebecq said in 2020 was right. He said the world will be the same, only a little worse. Was I naive? Was he right? Or are we right to hope that we can reach an inner-outer balance to better understand what is going on around us?
Well, as a Christian, I want to say we never lose hope. By the same token, I too have been disappointed to think that it seems we haven't learned very much collectively from COVID. Maybe some individuals have learned some things about themselves and have made some decisions about how they want to live their lives, but I don't see a big collective learning or any kind of shift. I see a lot of anger, and as you spoke about the media bulimia and the kind of what I kind of think of that talk show entertainment of, let's get two opposing views about vaccination or about COVID. Never mind, let's try to educate people or inform ourselves. No, let's create entertainment based on tragedy, stir up extra anger, because in some way this will get us good audience ratings. That may be excessively cynical on my part about the media, but it's what I felt was happening with COVID. It's what I felt is happening with the situation with the war in Ukraine. And so in a sense, that does make the world a little bit worse, because particularly if we're using tragedy of any sort, the tragedy of COVID, the tragedy of war, for audience ratings and entertainment rather than to build up the common good, then that does leave us a little bit worse off. In order to learn, it's what you were saying also about having to heal the wounds. And I have a hunch that we're not even very sure yet what the wounds are that we have experienced during COVID, that we probably are carrying some wounds that we're not really even personally aware of, that maybe we're aware that we've changed slightly or that something isn't quite right, but we're not maybe so easily able to name it, to explore it, to see where we take it. And it could be that it's kind of the buildup of this kind of woundedness of a whole series of individuals, because we each experienced COVID in a different way, that somehow the effect on the collective is such that we're still in quite a muddle and quite a mess with it all, really. So for this invasion to come on top of that, I think is particularly difficult, and one wonders whether the society has any resilience left at all to experience any hardship that might come about because of this war. So if it does mean I don't know, that prices rise, or we can't have our air conditioning the way we want it, or that we find a lot of foreigners in our cities and need to accommodate that in some way. I don't know how resilient our collective will be in being able to absorb that. And that's very worrying, because that's where you get a kind of social breakdown and inner social conflict within your own society.
Let me ask you a difficult question for different reasons, but especially because you are British.
I'm American, actually.
You're American. Okay.
Yes.
Well, British. I thought you were British. Anyway, this is about America and the Crown, actually. What is the difference between this war, so the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the war perpetrated by the US since the end of World War? We could name Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. What about the US invasion and occupation and political destabilization since 1946 under the guise of liberating, and in 1991 under the pretext of spreading liberal democracy? Maurizio Ferrara on Corriere della Sera, which I understand is exactly in front of where you are right now, or where your church is in Milan, looks at the US invasion of Iraq and underlines that some commentators observe that it was a predetermined carnage, just like that one of the last 10 days in Ukraine, which took place after months of preparation. Ferrara again reminds us, quoting Svetlana Alexievich, Nobel Prize for Literature, she has drawn a very clear picture of the imperiality impulses, not only of Putin, but also of a large part of the Russian population, the long wake of the Homo Sovieticus, and before that of the Tsarist tradition. But what about the imperialist impulses of the US? Apart from the US, every time the British invaded and occupied a country, they created problems and civil wars. Once they left, for example, Kenya, Cyprus, Palestine, and one could say they still occupy Ireland. Are the action by the British Crown and the death they cause any different than those of Stalin, the US, Putin, when colonial Britain occupied countries and took everything from them? The capitalist US invaded countries for geopolitical reasons for their goods. Somehow, this is what is Russia doing as well. What do you think? Is a provocative question, open-ended provocative question.
I do think that colonialism in its forms that have existed in the 19th century, the 20th century, and even, in recent times, there's a lot to condemn in it. It's not for nothing, in a sense, that Britain is giving up and has been giving up its colonies, that even countries in the Commonwealth are voting to leave the Commonwealth as they gain a new sense of kind of strength and capacity to run their own affairs, and their desire to exercise their agency in the world, freed from what looks to be a kind of imperial pressure on top of them. The US, I think, is in an awkward situation, I would say, having been taken from an isolationist view of the world, which is what they held really up until the times of the world wars, and ending up with this kind of hegemony, which you can say they want, but you can also say is also thrust upon them slightly. If peoples and nations look to a situation and say, gosh, democracy and capitalism look pretty good to me, because I can say what I want, I can do what I want, I can make money and have a good lifestyle. If that looks attractive, and other countries say, well, we'd kind of like that too. In a sense, it's not the US's fault that it has an attractiveness in part. Someone, I can't think of his name, but someone wrote a kind of interesting article, about this idea of the difference between hegemony and imperialist ambitions. I think that everyone has been pretty convinced that the war in Iraq was wrong. It was war in a country that was not responsible for what they were blaming it for. It was something which, as you say, had been planned and I think probably manipulated by both the UK government and the US government. And the question there is, how much was it perceived that Iraq was actually a threat to the Western world? There is this kind of difficult analysis of at what point do you seek to reduce a threat that exists in a nation that's not your own? So if you're perceiving, I don't know, a lot of terrorist activity that's going to come out of a place, do you seek to stop it before it reaches your home shores? That's not to justify the war in Iraq, because I do think that it was completely ill thought out. And the kind of regime change exercises in South America, there's so much that America needs to be sorry for having done. But I do think also that to say that the invasion of Ukraine is simply equivalent to the mistakes made by the US and Britain, I think it's overly simplistic. And to claim that NATO is an imperialist power in its own right, I think again is simplistic. And you know, with Ukraine, and the borders of Ukraine were drawn up some 30 years ago and signed off and agreed. What is the reason for this invasion? Ukraine was not threatening Russia, from what I know. Ukraine was not sending terrorists into Russia to destabilize Russia. Ukraine wasn't seeking to take over other bits of territory that it didn't already have. It's just very difficult to see a justification for this invasion. It just doesn't add up to being an equivalent of something else.
No, for sure, there is not a logic justification unless you want to look at the details of geopolitical strategies. A Russian colleague, actually sees the justification in the spiritual renaissance in Russia with Kirill. But I would like to offer you another view that is not mine, is from Maurizio Ferrar. Again, he said the war in Iraq gave an important shock to Europe, and we all remember it. In the wake of the massive street demonstration, two great European intellectuals, Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida, asked themselves the question, what binds Europeans together with respect to the international order? Their answer was a political mentality different from the American one and based on some common traits. An aversion to the use of force, first of all, and therefore an insistence on law and respect of international legality, support for a global system based on liberal multilateral institutions and on human rights, fruit of the past inspired by opposite principles characterized by centuries of bloody carnage. Precisely this mentality had to push Europe to build a foreign and security policy anchored to the EU, overcoming the stupid and simplistic opposition between war and peace. I believe this is the reason why Ukraine wants to go west and why Russia invaded Ukraine. Because when Ukraine goes west and embrace these values, it will become problematic for them. Not only because the NATO gets closer to them, but because next could be Belarus. And the second next could be Russia, really embracing these values, as perhaps in the '89 with Gorbachev. But that's why Gorbachev is considered as a traitor. And I was told bluntly by these Russian colleagues that you don't understand. You're a Westerner. We are Russian. It's different. What do you think?
I've seen it stated elsewhere that the fear in Russia or amongst certain of the Russian leadership is the fear of the liberal values. Call them, if you want, call them secular values, but they are the values of human dignity, of human agency, of individual liberty, of self-expression, to the extent that you're not interfering with somebody else's self-expression, the rule of law, and a desire in most of the European countries to create the grounds for a kind of equality, not just equality of opportunity, but a sense that there isn't, the kind of the class of the hyper rich and then the everybody else who's just the kind of the servant or the slave of that system. And so I can understand that that could be very frightening for Russia. And you can see then also why Ukraine would like to move west if that's what they're aiming towards. The question is, in a sense, having grown up in the generation that I did, in the country I did, growing up in America and then growing up in Italy, both countries very committed to the rule of law, to democracy, to the handing on of power, with all of the kind of flaws in those systems. But the commitment is to that and to the individual liberties and rights. I take it so much as a given that it's very hard for me to imagine that that is just of equal value to another system based on something else, and that we could just negotiate it away, either for ourselves or give it away for somebody else who's striving and wanting to have that as the way that their government is set up.
And I think this is why the reaction of especially European countries was so strong and worried, because this very reason was crack. And I hope another reason is that the co-construction of meaning is very important. Europe, the US, although with all the problematic, are still based on a co-construction of meaning and love. Let me close talking about love using Shimone and Sframeli, two very important theater actors and director, that said, love for others save them, save us, save the world. The world can only be saved by love. It's not a rhetorical act. Only love can win violence. What do you think as a priest?
I think there's, yes, the problem with the word love is that it's become so overladen with sentimentalism. Yeah. But the real content of love is immensely rooted in dignity and respect for the other person. And from looking at it from a kind of religious point of view, if you go right back to the Old Testament and the construction of the law, which is this gift from God to the Hebrew people, is the law, not because it's supposed to be annoying or restrict our freedom or make life difficult or give us a reason to get it wrong so God can bash us over the head and punish us. It's seen as a gift because it begins to enable people to live in community with respect for one another and to recognize that society needs to be based on a respect for others, not based on my personal capacity to exhibit power over you, but by agreed communal agreement to respect a structure which is bigger than we are, a kind of judicial structure. And so when Jesus then begins to speak about love in a more, a stronger and deeper way, it also has to do with the kind of love which is rooted in our capacity to set aside self and desire and greed and personal exercise of power in order to offer space, kindness, respect, mercy to those around us. So this idea of love is extremely deep, and it's not just an emotional thing, but it also has to do with how we structure our life as a society. So our supposedly secular European society, in effect, is very rooted in a religious tradition, which is a tradition going right back to this first giving of a law, which was about how we govern ourselves, how we find a way to live in communities and in cities and societies and nations with a a dignity and capacity to hold our common life together.
You said set aside self, and I think is very important. This is what is the risk now, you know, that actually to not be able to set aside self and being unable to perpetrate a co-construction of meaning. Thank you very much for your time. And
thank you for the conversation. It's been very good to meet you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Vickie. Thank you.
Goodbye.